The bride was called a cursed woman by the town, until a rich cowboy hand whispered, "I believe you." Snow clung to the chapel windows like frostbitten lace, dulling the sound of the world beyond. Inside, the pews groaned with the weight of whispers, tension thick as the cold air outside. No fire burned in the hearth that morning, and none dared light one in their glances. Clara stood alone at the altar, her breath shallow, her fingers white around a bouquet of pale wildflowers. Her wedding gown, simple, second-hand, but fitted with quiet dignity, rippled slightly with each shift of her stance. Her veil was pinned with care, her lips painted the color of cherry bark, but her eyes stayed steady. Too steady. From the pews came murmurs, thin and sharp. "She's cursed," they say. "That girl brings death, not love. Look what happened to the last one." A hunched woman in the third row leaned to her neighbor, muttering, "First husband died in a barn fire. Second disappeared near the canyon. Then the banker's son, gone like wind in wheat." No man sticks after touching her. No one dared speak too loudly, yet none looked away. The church bell had long since rung. The priest stood frozen, hands folded, lips pressed thin with dread. Still no groom. Still no footsteps at the door. Just Clara, motionless at the altar, like a statue carved from faith and foolishness. A rustling near the front. The best man stumbled forward, a letter in his shaking hands. The priest took it, read silently, then looked up, voice dry. "There will be no wedding today." He turned the page around. The handwriting was rough, the message brief. "I can't marry a woman marked by misfortune. I can't be next, I'm sorry." Clara did not blink. Her grip tightened around the stems of the bouquet. She did not cry, did not collapse. She stood with her back straight, her face pale but unshaken. Only her hands betrayed her, knuckles paling, petals crushed in her grasp. The silence in the room deepened. People shifted in their seats, uncertain whether to feel pity or vindication. Then a voice. Low, calm, unshaken. "If no one here believes her, then I will." All eyes turned. At the back of the chapel, near the last row, stood a man in a dark overcoat dusted with snow. He stepped forward slowly, removing his hat as he walked, revealing tousled hair the color of dried wheat. His boots echoed in the hush, and his presence drew whispers of its own. "That's Asher Calloway. Calloway's boy. The one who runs the southern fields. He's rich. Why would he?" He reached the altar, eyes never leaving Clara. She stared back, unmoving. "I don't know what's been said. I don't care what's been whispered. I know what I see." He took off his coat and gently draped it over her shoulders. "And I see a woman who's been blamed for too much, by people too scared to face their own cruelty." Gasps rippled through the church. Asher turned toward the crowd, calm and unflinching. "She deserves better than silence, and I won't let her stand alone." Clara looked at him then, truly looked. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes shimmered. But still no tears fell. He extended a hand. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she placed her hand in his. Together they turned and walked down the aisle, not as bride and groom, not yet, but as two people who had chosen to leave behind the judgment of others and step into whatever would come next. Behind them, the chapel stayed quiet. But outside, the snow had stopped falling. The ride to the Calloway estate was long and silent, the winter air sharp against Clara's skin, even with Asher's coat wrapped tightly around her. She did not ask where they were going. She did not need to. There was nowhere else to go. The house appeared just beyond a split in the hill, a grand estate with white columns and a wraparound porch, windows aglow with golden firelight. It stood like a symbol of power, tradition, and expectation. Clara sat straighter in the wagon seat, preparing herself for the next wave of judgment. Asher helped her down and led her up the steps without a word. The front door opened before they could knock. His mother stood in the entryway, arms crossed, her mouth a thin line of disapproval. His father followed behind, less expressive but just as cold. "What is she doing here?" his mother asked sharply. Asher didn't blink. "She's staying with me." "In this house," she hissed. "After what happened this morning?" "She's done nothing wrong," Asher replied. "You think misfortune isn't contagious," his father added, stepping closer. "People talk, Asher. Bringing her here brings shame, brings eyes." "She was left at the altar," Asher said, voice steady. "I will not leave her at the mercy of a town that chooses superstition over sense." "She's cursed," his mother snapped. "You'll lose everything, reputation, respect, maybe even your life. Just like the others." He stood taller. "If people cannot see what I see, then I do not need their agreement." He took Clara's hand and turned from them without another word. They rode again, this time away from the estate, away from legacy and name. Clara didn't speak, didn't cry. Her silence was no longer from fear, it was a decision, a kind of strength. An hour later they arrived at a clearing near a slow-running stream. There, tucked beneath a cluster of pines, stood a cabin, small, solid, and quiet. Its porch was short, its chimney still warm. Smoke curled lazily from the flue. Asher tied the horse, then opened the door. "This is mine," he said. "I built it years ago. For no one else but me." He glanced at her. "Until now." The cabin's interior was simple but cared for. A single room divided by shelves, with a bed tucked near the fire, a table set with 2 plates, and a quilt folded across the back of a handmade chair. She walked in slowly, her fingers grazing the edge of the wooden counter. On the nightstand near the bed lay a small object wrapped in linen. She opened it. Inside was a wooden comb, delicate, hand-carved, familiar. Her breath caught. "I sold this at the summer market. Years ago," she whispered. "I bought it," Asher said. "You smiled at me that day, handed me the change, and I thought. I'd never seen sunlight wear a face before." Clara stared at him, stunned. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "You weren't meant to," he replied. "You had a fiancé. I had silence." She held the comb, tears rising now not from pain, but from something deeper, the ache of being seen, finally, after all the years of being feared. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. "There's hot water in the basin and firewood stacked outside. I'll tend to the horse." She turned toward the hearth, the flicker of flame casting warmth into the corners of the room. Behind her, the door closed gently. And for the first time in a long, long while, she felt like someone had opened one. The days slipped into a rhythm neither of them named, as though the land itself had set the pace, and they were simply following its quiet lead. Each morning, Clara rose with the first light, the sky still blue-gray with sleep. She moved softly through the cabin, careful not to wake anything that did not wish to be woken. Outside, the air still held the bite of winter, but she stepped into the garden anyway, boots crunching softly on the thawing ground. The earth was stubborn, the soil not yet ready to yield, but she worked it gently, turning it over where she could, clearing away dead leaves and brittle stems, brushing her fingers along the stubborn roots that had survived the frost. She planted small things that took time, carrots, sage, hope. She hummed while she worked, melodies with no words. Sometimes hymns, sometimes songs from her childhood. Tunes that had no business surviving all she had lost but had stayed anyway, tucked somewhere deep. Asher, for his part, worked without fanfare. He repaired the fence line that ran the edge of the clearing, the rhythmic thud of his hammer floating down toward the garden. In the afternoons, he chopped wood near the barn, or took apart rusted tools, cleaning and oiling each piece, like he was coaxing old things back to life. He moved with the steadiness of someone who had never rushed a day in his life, and never would. They did not talk much, but their lives threaded around each other like vines climbing a shared wall. When Clara went to hang the wash one morning, a second clothesline had already been strung between 2 pine trees, the twine tight new. When she struggled with the stove, mumbling to herself about the broken flint, she found a new one set beside the matches by nightfall. One evening, as she folded laundry by the fire, she said aloud, mostly to herself, but perhaps not entirely, "I get cold right before dawn. It creeps in through the floor." She didn't expect an answer, and none came. But the next morning, the window by her bed had been sealed, the gaps patched tight with cedar shavings. And at the foot of her mattress, an extra quilt had appeared, thick, hand-stitched, navy blue with gold thread running along the edges like sunlight trapped in fabric. She didn't mention it, but she didn't fold it away, either. Then, one afternoon, while dusting the shelves, she dropped a glass. It shattered against the wood floor, and Clara instinctively knelt, gathering shards with trembling fingers. She wasn't afraid, not of Asher, but the memory of being blamed for every broken thing still lived under her skin. "I'm sorry," she whispered to no one. That evening, a new glass sat on the kitchen table. Next to it was a folded napkin. Not just any cloth, but one embroidered carefully at the corner in tiny, neat stitches. Just one letter. C. She stared at it for a long time, her heart caught between breath and something heavier. They lived like a married couple without the ceremony. No ring, no name change, no witnesses. Yet somehow, more real than any vow she had ever heard. Asher never hovered, never pushed. But when she needed something, a pan, a patch, a pause, it appeared. Quietly. As if he had already known. Some nights they passed each other by the fire, nodding gently. Other nights they sat in stillness, content with nothing more than the soft crackle of flame and the company of someone who didn't need saving or speaking. One moonlit evening, Clara stepped out onto the porch, arms folded against the chill. The trees rustled in the breeze, and the stream below shimmered silver in the light. Asher joined her, his boots whispering on the boards. He stood beside her, hands in his pockets, gaze turned toward the hills. They stood like that for a while, not touching. Then Clara spoke. "I'm not cursed," she said softly. "That's not what this is." He didn't move, didn't interrupt. She continued, voice trembling. "I'm not cursed. I've just been left behind. Over and over. When it got hard. When I needed someone to stay." The silence stretched, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full of breath held, of meaning forming. Then he answered, just above a whisper. "I don't go." She turned to him, eyes searching. "You don't?" He shook his head. "No." And that was all. But it was enough. In the hush that followed, they stood a little closer, the air warming slightly between them. Not lovers, not strangers, just two souls who had chosen quietly not to walk away. And sometimes that is the beginning of love. The wind carried the scent of pine and fresh earth through the open cabin window as Clara moved about the main room, sorting through a box of folded linens Asher had brought down from the attic. It was early spring, and she'd suggested finally clearing the loft, turning it into a space where she could teach music to the neighbors' children, if any ever dared venture near again. She pulled out old blankets, a tin box of nails, a tattered leather book. Then, tucked between two yellowed shirts, her fingers found a frame wrapped in burlap. She peeled it back slowly. It was a sketch. A drawing done in pencil on thick parchment, rough but striking, and familiar. Her own face stared back at her, captured with a tenderness that caught her breath. She was younger in the image, her hair pinned loosely, eyes wide with something between joy and nervousness. In the drawing she wore a dress she remembered vividly, sea green, slightly too long for her legs, the one she wore to the spring market 5 years ago. She walked into the living room, the sketch clutched in her hands. Asher was sitting at the table, whittling a new wooden handle for a broken tool. He looked up at her, then at the frame in her grasp. Clara did not speak immediately. She held it out. He set down the knife. "I found this in the attic," she said. He nodded slowly. "I forgot it was still up there." "You drew this?" "Yes." "Pues." She studied his face, the way his eyes held hers now without looking away. "When?" 5 years ago," he said. "Spring market." Her breath caught. "That was the first time I ever wore this dress." "I remember," he said quietly. "You were buying apples. You dropped one and laughed to yourself like no one else was watching." "You saw that?" "I saw everything." She blinked, stunned. "But I don't remember seeing you." "I didn't say anything. You were with someone." "My fiancé." He nodded. "I watched you laugh with him. I watched you walk away. And I told myself that I'd probably never see you again. But I kept the moment." Clara looked down at the drawing, running a thumb along the edge of the paper. "You kept me." "I kept what I saw," he said. "The way you looked at the world. Like it hadn't broken you yet." Her lips parted, but the words wouldn't come. Asher stood slowly, moving closer. "I didn't follow you," he said. "Not like a shadow. But I listened. People talk. I heard when you married. I heard when he died. I heard the rumors." He swallowed. "I didn't believe them." Clara's voice cracked. "You knew I was hurting." "I didn't think I could do anything," he said. "I wasn't supposed to be anything to you. I just couldn't stop carrying that day." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. All this time she whispered. The cabin. The little things. The silence that never felt heavy. He nodded. "You did all this. Because you'd already seen me. Before I ever fell apart." A tear slipped down her cheek. Asher reached out, slowly, and wiped it with the edge of his thumb. "I didn't wait to save you," he said. "I waited because I hoped one day you might see me too." Clara pressed the sketch against her chest, eyes closing for a moment. Then she opened them, and looked at him not as someone picking up broken pieces, but as someone who had loved the shape of her long before the cracks. And for the first time she believed that maybe not every silence was abandonment. Some were just the quiet of love waiting for its time. The invitation came folded in soft linen, tucked beneath a sack of flour left quietly on their porch one morning. It wasn't signed with a full name, just initials in a line that read, "I heard you used to teach. Would you consider showing my youngest a few notes? He won't sit still for anyone but music." Clara held the letter for a long time, her thumb brushing over the curve of each handwritten letter. She hadn't taught since the last time someone whispered her name like a warning. Since the day she was asked to leave her post because a mother feared her child would catch misfortune like a cold. But something in the note wasn't asking for courage, it was offering it. She folded it carefully and said yes. The boy arrived 2 days later. By the week's end, he brought his sister. By the following, Clara had 6 students, and laughter echoing from the cabin's windows like wind chimes. She taught from the dining table at first. The space was small, the old piano slightly off-key, but none of the children noticed. They came back with wider smiles and stories in their hands, eager to learn scales and chords, to stop in rhythm, to sing without shame. Asher didn't say anything about the classes, but chairs began to appear, 6 of them, hand-built, the perfect height for little legs. Extra pencils filled a cup on the shelf. Chalk rested in a wooden tray beside the stove. Every need met before she voiced it. Then, one Sunday morning, Clara woke to find Asher gone. The horses were still in the corral, but his tools were missing. She found him behind the cabin hours later, sleeves rolled to the elbows, covered in sawdust. He said nothing, just nodded toward a pile of beams and went back to work. By Thursday, a door appeared in the back wall of the cabin, one that hadn't been there before. Clara opened it slowly. A room had been reborn. Fresh pine boards covered the floor, clean and warm. A small chalkboard hung neatly at the front. The old piano had been moved in and cleaned until its keys shone like porcelain. A row of shelves held music books she hadn't seen in years, and on the far wall hung a hand-carved sign that read, "Miss Clara's room." She stood there for a long time, unable to move. He had built her a classroom, not to help, not to redeem, but to return her to herself. That night, after the last student had skipped home down the dirt trail, Clara sat at the piano. The fire crackled beside her. Her hands hovered above the keys. She began to write. The melody started soft, like a memory knocking. Then it grew, bolder, hopeful, layered in years she thought she'd lost, and moments she never expected to have again. The notes curved gently, looping in a way that felt like something once far away had come back near. She titled the song Somewhere He Was Watching. She left the sheet on the piano bench, unsigned. The next morning it was gone. She looked for it briefly, quietly. Not with suspicion, with understanding. Because above the piano, framed in smooth oak, the sheet now hung beneath glass. Flattened, preserved, protected. No one said a word. But when she pressed her fingers to the corner of the frame, she could feel the faintest trace of his touch. That was the language they spoke, not in declarations, but in actions. In placing a frame around the thing she had left behind. In turning silence into belief. And that was all the answer she needed. They came near sundown when the sky burned gold behind the hills and the wind had gone strangely still. 3 riders. Dust on their boots, anger in their posture. They didn't dismount, just stood near the fenceline, faces tight, hands hovering close to holsters. Asher saw them first. He was chopping wood near the barn, sleeves rolled, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. Clara was inside, humming softly as she prepared supper, unaware of the storm rolling in. The tallest rider called out, voice sharp like barbed wire. "We need to talk." Asher set the axe down and walked to the edge of the porch. "I'm listening," he said, calm but firm. "You need to send her away," the man said, "before this goes too far." Another man leaned forward in the saddle, smirking. "You're making a mistake, Asher. Keeping a woman like her, you'll lose everything, your name, your contracts, your standing." "She's bad luck," the third added. "And this town's patience is wearing thin." Clara appeared at the door then, apron still on, hands trembling slightly as she saw them. Asher stepped in front of her. "I don't remember asking for anyone's patience," he said. The smirking man chuckled. "You think protecting her makes you noble? No one respects you anymore, Calloway. You're just the fool who fell for the town's shadow." "I'd rather fall for her," Asher said evenly, "than stand beside men who tremble at their own reflections." The first man's hand moved. Too fast. A flash of metal. Gunfire cracked. Asher shoved Clara behind him. The bullet grazed his shoulder, slicing through flesh just beneath the collarbone. He stumbled but did not fall. He drew his revolver and fired once, not to kill, but to warn. The bullet slammed into the dirt inches from the smirking man's boot. "Next one's not for warning," he growled. The 3 riders froze. Tension hung in the air like gun smoke. Then, with a scowl, they turned their horses. "This ain't over," the tall one spat. "No," Asher said, "it's not. It's just beginning." They rode off into the dust, their pride more bruised than their boots. Asher turned, his breath shallow. Blood soaked the side of his shirt, but he stayed on his feet. Clara rushed to him, her eyes wide with panic. "You're hurt." "I'm all right," he said, but his voice was tight with pain. She helped him inside, guiding him to the table. He winced as he sat, and she tore fabric into strips, boiled water, her fingers trembling as she cleaned the wound. "You shouldn't have stood there," she whispered. "I had to." "Oh. They could have killed you." "They didn't. But they tried." He looked at her then, tired, pale, bleeding, and still, his gaze was steady. "I'd stand there again," he said. "As many times as it takes." She pressed the cloth to his wound, trying to hold herself together. "I used to think I was a burden," she said softly. "Something people carried until I broke their backs." He didn't respond, just watched her. Her hands shook harder. "But you make me believe," she continued, voice barely above a whisper, "that someone could choose to carry me. Not because they have to, but because they want to." She lifted her gaze to meet his. "Because they love me." Asher reached up, his good hand brushing her cheek. "I do," he said. And in the silence that followed, she let the tears fall, not from fear this time, but from finally being chosen. It was a gray morning, quiet and slow, with soft rain drizzling over the hills like a veil. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting warmth into the corners of the cabin, and Clara found herself alone in the music room, organizing papers the children had left behind after their last lesson. She hummed as she worked, her fingers gently arranging pages of scales, chord sheets, and little drawings made in the margins. The room smelled of wood polish and lavender. Her hands moved to the bench where she kept her private compositions, and as she lifted the lid, she felt something small, round and cool slip beneath her fingertips. A ring. She pulled it free slowly. It was iron, slightly rusted in one spot but smooth and shaped with purpose. No jewel, no design, no shine, just a perfect, solid loop, strong, unbreakable, humble. The kind of metal used to tether gates. The kind that held fences firm in the wind. She slipped it onto her finger. It fit. Exactly. There was no note, no velvet box, no speech. Just the ring. Just the silence that had always meant something between them. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. That afternoon, Asher returned from the far pasture. His boots were muddy, and his hat dripped with rain. He stepped onto the porch, looked at her once, and nodded slightly. Not an order, not a command. A gesture, an invitation. She followed him wordlessly through the trees behind the cabin, the rain thinning into mist. They passed the edge of the garden and walked a trail she had never taken. The path curved gently with the slope of the land, lined with old stones and moss. The sound of running water grew louder. Then the trees opened into a clearing by the stream. And Clara froze. The ground along the bank had bloomed. Not wild and random, but carefully, intentionally. Bluebells. Daisies, tiny yellow poppies. Clusters of white flowers that bent under the weight of mist. They wrapped the clearing like garland, blooming in soft defiance against the cold. Flowers she recognized, the same type she had once sold in seed pouches at the spring market, years ago. "You planted these?" she asked, breathless. Asher nodded, his voice low. "One for every time you smiled." Clara turned, eyes wide. "All this time?" "I started when I first built the cabin. I didn't know you'd ever see them." "Why here?" He looked at the water. "This is the first place I knew I'd want you to stay." She stepped forward, kneeling near the stream, brushing her fingers through the damp petals. "I never thought I'd belong anywhere again," she whispered. "You don't have to belong to a place," he said. "Just to someone willing to stay." They sat together on the edge of a flat stone, the water running slow beneath them, swirling around the rocks like a gentle hymn. She looked down at the ring again, twisting it slightly on her finger. "You never asked," she said, voice soft. "You never needed me to," he replied. She smiled, blinking back tears. "Most people need big words, vows, spectacle. I needed you to know I meant it," he said, without saying what everyone else says. She looked at him, really looked, the man who had loved her quietly, who had waited without expectation, who had stood between her and the world not because he had to, but because he chose to. "I don't need a big wedding," she said. "I don't need flowers in every pew or a minister or a dress people approve of. I know. I just want a home," she whispered, "where people stay. Where they don't run when it's hard. Where they don't call me a burden for being bruised." Asher reached for her hand. "You have it," he said, "and you always will." Their fingers laced, warm despite the cold. The rain had stopped. Above them, the clouds began to part, and the light that broke through was soft and gold, catching on the petals and in her hair. And in that moment, there were no witnesses, no signatures, no ceremony. Just a girl who had been abandoned too many times. And a man who had made a promise without saying a word. The spring festival came with music in the wind and color in the trees. After a long winter, the town came alive, lanterns strung between porches, tables laid out with pies and preserves, fiddles tuning near the square. Children ran barefoot across grass just turned green, their laughter echoing through the hills like bells. And Clara stood at the edge of it all, her hands resting gently on the piano keys set on the makeshift wooden stage near the chapel steps. The mayor had invited her, not out of pity, but with genuine hope. "Play something true," he'd said. "Something we all need to hear." She took a slow breath. The crowd was hushed. Townsfolk leaned in, unsure what to expect. Some still carried doubt in their eyes. Others a quiet curiosity. And some, the children she'd taught, the mothers who had come to trust her, smiled with quiet pride. Clara began to play. The song was called "I Am Not a Curse." Its notes were low at first, uncertain like footsteps in mud. Then the melody lifted, wounded but rising, a sound like someone learning to speak again after being told too long to stay silent. It was not perfect, but it was honest. And as the last chord lingered in the air, something shifted. The silence did not return with judgment. It came heavy with understanding. Then applause. Soft at first. Then stronger. Then everywhere. Children clapped and shouted. A few women wiped their eyes. Even the blacksmith, known more for grunts than words, nodded once, slow and approving. From the front row, an old woman stepped forward. It was the same woman who had once hissed that Clara was marked by something dark. Now she held out a crown of woven spring flowers, buttercups, violets, clover. Her voice shook. "You made something bloom where we only expected stone. I was wrong." Clara took the crown, her eyes glistening. "Thank you." She stepped down from the stage, and the sea of people parted not in fear, but in quiet reverence. Asher stood waiting near the tree line, arms folded, the last rays of sunlight catching in his hair. She reached him and took his hand. Together they walked to the edge of the hill, where the wind moved through the wildflowers he had once planted for her, where the horizon stretched without end. Clara leaned into him, her voice low. "I never needed to be everyone's hope. I just didn't want to be everyone's fear." "You're not," he said. She turned to him, her hand tightening around his. "I'm not cursed." "No," he said, "you're a storm. And storms don't destroy. They change the shape of the world." Then he leaned in, lips brushing her hair. "If you are a curse," he whispered, "then let me be the man who stands in the wind and holds it close. Because loving you feels like choosing to live." And in that moment, with the sky painted gold and the world listening differently, Clara smiled like someone who had finally come home. Some stories are not about being saved. They are about being seen, truly, finally, without fear. She was never cursed. She was just waiting for someone brave enough to stay. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever felt misunderstood, silenced, or left behind, remember Clara. Remember that love does not always arrive with a grand entrance. Sometimes it waits in quiet cabins, in wildflower clearings, in rusted rings that fit just right. And if you want more stories like this, where love walks through fire, where silence speaks louder than crowds, where the heart is the last frontier, subscribe to Wild West Love Stories. Because out here, love may come quiet, but it stays loud in the soul.